Pat, I always enjoy speaking with you because of your broad-ranging interests and your willingness to enter into other fields like theology out of your field of expertise, which is really literature, and to draw on that. No, I mean in a positive way. I enjoy speaking with you along that line. And I want to talk about the topic of social sin, which has come to the fore in the last few decades in theological circles. It plays off against what we call personal sin. Personal sin we're very familiar with. That is when we culpably and blameworthy fashion go against our conscience, or as many authors like to say, fail to love or fail to create harmony in our world, escape from reality, as my mentor Karl Rahner likes to say, to blameworthy, culpable fashion, to escape from real life. Anyway, whatever we call personal sin, we all know it. It's when we, in some fashion, willfully put up with the gap between our performance and our ideals. But there's also a category called social sin, which is quite different, and which suggests that these personal sins that we commit, and that if people have committed over the years, get embedded in institutions. They take on a life of their own. They influence structures and systems, so that institutions become sometimes unjust, and symbols are created in the culture which distort our consciousness, and so we don't see the world in any accurate fashion. And all of that social sin in this analysis ends up leading to public policies which hurt people, decisions by groups, families, economic groups, institutions, labor unions, churches, all kind of institutions, making decisions that are not enlightened, which end up hurting people more than helping them. So that, by way of long introduction to set the framework for our discussion, I want to talk a little bit about social sin as it relates to public policy questions and decisions made by groups and institutions. Again, I give you the opportunity to latch onto that at any point if you care to. And
well, I think one that comes to mind, and I say this partly because I live in Adrian, Michigan now, and I read the Detroit Free Press every day, and it's a very depressing rag to read because of all the violence particularly on the part of young people toward young people. Detroit has become
killing of people
a lot of
high
killing
schools
children,
and,
killing children, children killing teachers. As a teacher, that always makes me just a little nervous.
I guess so.
Detroit has a lot of problems, and certainly one of the major roots of these problems is the fact that so many of the factories that at one time employed a lot of minority people who came to Detroit from the South have relocated in Juarez, Mexico, or somewhere else, perhaps outside of the country's boundaries, in order to get inexpensive labor, and that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who do not have decent employment. I think this is a decision that certainly fits under the category of social sin. How is it that somehow we do not have some sort of national laws in place or state laws in place that prevent companies from simply picking up with no apparent concern for the persons who have worked for them and who are now going to be unemployed and forced to rely on a welfare system if they cannot find jobs commensurate to their abilities, and giving them a salary which can support them and families, whether these are men or women. I think this is a national problem that really requires addressing.
That's a great example, Pat. It seems to me to bring out a lot of aspects of social sin. One is that the people involved very often in the decisions are not bad people, and they're not out to hurt others. They are imprisoned in the system themselves, so that what happens with corporations these days is that they must show a profit, and they must do it on a short-term kind of basis, and they must find the ways to satisfy the stockholders. That this becomes the driving force within the economic world. And I was just talking to corporate people lately who's saying, what a contrast that is to, for example, the Japanese policies, where there would be long-term, where they'd be interested in penetrating the market and give up profits for quite a long period of time in order to try to get into that market, hoping for longer-term gains. Whereas our corporations in the United States are almost forced by circumstances to show the quick profit and to think in shorter terms. And so we've got people at the head of these corporations making decisions about moving factories or whatever, as you're saying, out of the inner cities, and they're part of the system themselves. I mean, even if they would sit there and say, well, we're really worried about these people that we used to serve here and that worked in our factories, and let's see what we can do for them, they probably would have a terrible time of still keeping the factory there because they can show greater profit by going someplace else. And there's all kind of pressures in the system to do that. So that this idea of social sin and its institutional character just keeps growing, getting more interlocking, more interdependent until it becomes global. I mean, you can almost see, I'm getting a little carried away here maybe, but sort of a web of social sin that covers the whole earth, that covers the whole globe. Some people have, for example, have talked about the theory of dependency, much disputed, but some people say, well, Latin American countries do badly precisely because they're dependent upon the United States to buy their particular, like bananas or zinc or copper, and then therefore they can't grow food for their own people. Well, you get disputes on that because there's people on the other side who'll say, well, that's not the problem because Japan trades with us, Korea does, and so on, and everything's fine, and they thrive. So I don't mean to really to come down on either side of that thing, except this perception that social sin grows and becomes more intertwined, so that so many people walking around feel like Max Weber said would happen in the modern world, the bureaucratic maze would feel like it was an iron cage. There's no way out. And that might be one way of beginning to think about the example that you used. Now, it could go another way, too. You could have leaders of a particular corporation who are totally insensitive and totally unconcerned about the way people are handled, and they don't do anything for the people who live in that area or have been loyal to the company. I'm not saying it can't be personally sinful, but I think in many cases it isn't. It is a matter more of an institutional situation that ends up hurting people.
Pragmatics, and that's where perhaps we need, government support, or we need perhaps some
alternate strategy. So take for example in
that's what I was going to say,
Youngstown
alternate
area.
Strategies.
Yeah, like Youngstown area, when they were going to close the steel mills, at least the churches got together and made some sort of massive effort to see if they couldn't keep the steel mills open there, take employee ownership, things like that might try to save it. I think that whole effort was not terribly successful, but we do have some successful examples where for example, the workers kept the factory open by taking it over by becoming the owners effectively of it, and where they worked harder and improved productivity and all kind of good things like that. I always get hope out of those things. But that's one example of how you would cut through social sin and really sort of structure it in some better fashion. And you end up seeing that you don't have solutions by giving people food baskets at Christmas, that you need to come up with larger strategic kinds of approaches to all of this. Pat, would it help if we tried to find some other examples of where organizations, systems, groups have acted on false consciousness and perhaps messed up the common good in one way or another?
Well, let me just throw another one out. Since I get to prisons fairly often as a prison chaplain, I think we really need to examine the sorts of laws that we have put into place regarding drug selling. The prison population across the country is 1.2 million persons now, it's more than doubled in the last 5 years, and largely because there are mandatory sentencing now for a number of drug offenses for which previously there would only be a fine. Unfortunately, because it's so expensive to incarcerate women and men and to keep them in prison for any period of time, there aren't monies left over for programs. So what we are doing is warehousing people, not dealing with what has caused them to get into drug habits in the first place, which might be the frustration of not finding a job, or simply might be a habit that needs some sort of therapeutic intervention, and then releasing them after a period of time, some wasted months or years, back into the community with no further skills, no further psychological aids to avoid repeating whatever it is that has gotten them incarcerated in the first place. And again, I think these are group decisions that are made that are hurting the social fabric and that need to be examined.
Now, singing, Pat, when you were talking how complex this gets, and even in terms of public policies where we're trying to help people, how we created a problem. Example, mental health area.
Yes.
People in mental health institutions thought that social planners got, well, we'll be better off if we can get them into halfway houses. We'll get them out of those terrible large
small
institutions,
group homes.
small group homes, get them into neighborhoods, get them into the cities and so on, and this will help the overall situation. What has happened out of that whole effort is we've produced a whole lot of homeless people and who can't fend for themselves and are on the streets and are prey to others and don't know how to handle things and becomes another aspect of the social problem. The web is just so terribly complicated. Now, in that case, you know, this whole analysis of social sin, you hardly know what to make of it, because I think the people in that situation were thinking, now, these mentally ill people are, you know, they're not treated well, and it's terrible to be in institutions. They wanted to do good for them, and even this decision they made ended up hurting things.
That's right. They would thrive more maybe in a more home-like environment,
Yeah.
you know, maybe the small group home concept.
And we ended up with multiplying the numbers
Yeah.
of homeless people tremendously. I'm not sure if our category of social sin breaks down there or not, but I suppose it calls into question the whole economic system, the whole way we function in this country, and the social sin would get located not precisely in this committee or this governmental policy that moved in this direction, but in the larger economic structure that we would see operative in our country.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that doesn't, in a sense, get too abstract. Maybe we could think of public policy things that have a different character. Let's try the church's attitude towards the gay community. Here,
any particular church you have?
Yeah, well, I was thinking of our own Catholic community in this regard, and of statements issued by the Vatican in relationship to members of the gay community. I think you could make a case, if you use the categories of social sin, you could say, well, here's an institution that is not treating gay people very well. You could say that they have set up an ideology through official documents that would say, well, gays partake in a disordered existence somehow, and that this creates sort of negative images of gay people, and then you get policy decisions that, well, they can't be involved in particular church activities or things like that. I really probably should be more specific on that, but maybe at least some people would question the policies decisions that have come out of the church in regards to gay people.
I think the church, and specifically the Catholic Church, represents every pole of view on homosexuality as we would find in the culture generally, with some bishops having made pastoral statements that are very compassionate, with many clergy, many women and men in the Catholic community being very supportive of the homosexuals within the church and participating with them very often at rituals, for instance. On the other hand, official statements have been harsh, and it seems that there is an interesting fusion on the part of those we would like to see most enlightened, namely those who have the power, who are authority figures in the church. They seem to be imprisoned in some fundamentalist interpretation of one or two texts within our scriptures. I think that's rather anomalous and a little bit scary, since we would hope that the exploration of the scriptures, with the insights of those who have studied languages, social sciences, etc., would have brought us to a different point, so that we would not have from the top statements made that suggest that the reading of certain passages is done in a very dualistic and fundamentalist manner at this point.
Mm-hmm. So we end up.
Is that clear?
Well, I think elements of it.
Elements
were
of it were clear.
Clear
Okay.
to me. I thought I was following your line of thought there,
All right.
I believe that. There's a lot of questions, and you're going to get differences of opinion, I think, on a lot of those questions. But what would be clear is that eventually the way you view the question is going to influence your public policy or church policy in this case. And I think that then it becomes can you look at your overall view and find ways that will make you tolerant, open, helpful to the gay community. And I think sometimes in dioceses and particular bishops and so on have found ways to do that. Instead of making members of the gay community feel outcast, they have tried to make sure they feel welcomed and open, and the parishes are open to them and so on. They've tried to set that sort of approach to it. On the other hand, you get counter examples where, at least if you take your reading from how the gay community has responded, and I've talked to some after the Vatican announcements have come out who were just on homosexuality, who have just been terribly hurt, angry, in a rage, upset, because they can see that the policy is leading in a destructive direction from their viewpoint. So if you can take your cues from the reactions, then some of this really has to be called into question.
That's right. And again, I guess I would just repeat that there is biological evidence that has come out in this past year that supports what I've believed for a long time, that there is a physiological basis for the homosexual orientation of a certain percent of people within the culture.
Something like 10%, I think, is the usual figure used.
Yes. I just find it amazing, I guess, that this could be discounted, or that somehow an onus of guilt could be put upon people who are, who simply discover themselves to be of a certain orientation, in the same way that I discover myself to be female and to have blue eyes as opposed to brown eyes and maleness. And so, I find this disturbing and upsetting, and I would hope again that the sensus fidelium will prevail ultimately in this.
By that you mean the real sensitivities of the whole people of God,
the community,
the community
the larger
as a whole.
Community. That's right.
Which it says in Lumen Gentium of Vatican II that the whole people of God, anointed as they are by the Spirit, cannot err in matters of faith, that they are sort of kept on track. And Cardinal Newman was very taken by the fact that the sensus fidelium, as you said, the sense of faith held by the whole people, proved to be more orthodox during the Arian heresy than the position of the bishops. Newman was of the opinion that it was the faithful, the laity as a whole, that kept alive the Orthodox faith, more so than the bishops during the Arian heresy time. So I think there is a point to be made in what you were saying there. What you're going to find on the specific question we're talking about here is probably a lot of mixed opinion within the Catholic Church on the homosexual question, but surely one has to, if you're going to use social sin type analysis, you got to go back and say, where is there false consciousness, and in what ways are we sort of off the track in all of this, and what's kind of stereotypical thinking has really come into my mind and heart along this line. Am willing to deal with people of homosexual orientation as human beings and look at the scientific evidence that we find about all of this, that surely would be part of finding a solution to the whole question. And so we have to try to work this thing out and to try to see where we might go with all of this, and to figure out how the social sin needs to be dealt with, and whether we can end up making progress with it all. What examples we've had here, Pat? There's sort of examples from the church and the way we would look at the whole thing, and other kinds of examples maybe that we would need to bring forth to fill out this picture and to see in what directions we're going with it. Could we look at, say, the political world and decisions that have been made about welfare matters, for example, public policy on welfare? If we had any kind of enlightened policy, in what ways would false consciousness sort of influence our thinking on this? I mean, the great and clear example of all of this is that in the United States, the perception that we have a whole bunch of lazy people who are purposely taking advantage of the system and who could work but don't, and that they fill up the welfare rolls. And then that has been propagated by all kind of images of people on welfare driving Cadillacs and so on. I mean, I don't think anybody denies that there's abuses of that system. And but what we know is that something like 90% of the people on welfare cannot work, are either too young, too old, or disabled in some way, and are not able really to hold down full-time jobs. So we would need clearer thinking on that, but any public policies that would flow out of that false understanding of the plight of the poor in our country would be a good example of social sin, it would seem to me.
Even decisions by groups deciding whether or not to allow children to stay in the family, it's very tricky. It's an ambivalent area, but often the decision is strongly in favor of the parent. The parent, may be abusive, and we're hearing more and more stories of how, in fact, this has been the case so often. But a policy is set which appears to be enlightened and which appears to benefit the child and the mother in ways that will ultimately be healthy. And then this is not always the case. So you're right. I think we have to constantly look at all our social policy and allow for the fact that maybe it needs to be adjusted to fit the new realities and our new enlightenment.
One policy that's always intrigued me is that enterprise zone notion of trying to give tax breaks to corporations to locate within inner cities or in areas where minorities might be able to get to work and so on. It's always it struck me as being a helpful idea, but then I listen to other commentators and it gets so complex who say, well, the main problem is not that minorities have to drive to jobs, and people would find a way to get there if they did have the jobs. That the real problem is that employers have stereotypical thinking in relationship to minority prospects and those in the dominant culture. And so they've done these studies. They will give people the same portfolio, dress them in exactly the same clothes, send out a white person and a black person to try to get the same job, and find out that the one will be treated differently than the other, and the white person will end up getting the job. And some commentators say that's the problem, that you've got that kind of stereotypical thinking going on. I really, don't know that, but I just know there's a debate on it, and it's hard to sort out. But we need public policy questions that would really address whatever is at root with the problem. What's the radical understanding of the problem? And it's social sin analysis is supposed to point us to that direction and to see what is radically wrong with the system. You could take some other things like that have worked well, like cooperative housing, the idea that you would make public policy decisions based on the fact that people own their own place, that they feel good about it, that they take pride in it. So sometimes you've had these policies that will allow minorities to take over an apartment building and fix it up, and it becomes their own, and they take pride in it, and they find a way to keep drugs out of it, and and so on. Those would be examples of where public policy might start to move us in healthier directions and help us to improve the quality of life in our country. So we got all kinds of things I think we would have to turn our attention to if we're going to, do better with this whole thing. One thing I know, Pat, for sure is we got to get rid of this idea of collective guilt. When I talk like that, people will say, for collective guilt, you're trying to tell me I'm responsible for slavery. You're trying to tell me that I'm sinning and what's going on. And I think that's vitally important to get beyond that. This whole analysis of social sin has got nothing to do with collective guilt. It does have to do with something I heard you say on one occasion, that is collective responsibility.
Responsibility for our history.
Yeah, and we have to be able to look at that and say, well, look at, we have to try to create a better society, and we all have to work at it together, and both the dominant group and the minority groups have to be part of that whole effort. So we can't make progress just by pointing fingers at one another or involving ourselves in stereotypical thinking, but we need to have a collective sense of responsibility, that institutions, if they're unjust, we have to reform them. If indeed we're in a situation of false consciousness, people don't think clearly about out-groups, about other people, men thinking about women, vice versa, members of the heterosexual community looking at the homosexual community. If we're not thinking clearly, if we're not seeing people as persons, we're stereotyping them, then we've got to get beyond that. And if it's a matter of public policy questions, as we've been talking about here, then we have to find a way to do better with that and insist that we find policies that serve people. That's been the great thing I think the Catholic community has championed in the last decade. We got to find public policies that serve people, that help human beings live more productively. And then a social sin analysis really makes sense and helps us to move forward.